Welcome back to the episode, everyone. On today's show, we have Tom Dutta, the Quiet Warrior. Tom, welcome to the show.
Hey, it's great to be here, VJ. Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely, I absolutely love your story, and just for the audience, can you go through your story just so we could all be on the same page?
Oh gosh, I mean, how much time do you have? There's just so many things, but I guess I'll start with, I came into this world just like you as a young guy uh, who had ambitions. I was born in the UK, so my father was in the British military. I was actually born on a military base, and my parents are from the Fiji Islands. My grandparents from India. And at that time being born, you have neurons in your brain and there's nothing in them. And we migrated from there to Canada when I was a young guy, about age 6. But the thing is that today, when I talk about my background, I used to be introduced as Tom, the CEO and top executive. Today, I really introduce myself as a storyteller, a thought leader. And VJ, a thought leader is somebody who basically tells stories through a lens that's unique about their life. And I, I mean, going back to my childhood, my father was a commanding officer in the military, but he became a violent man. He was very sloppy drunk. I was homeless at age 12. There's a lot of violence and hurt on the family, and I grew up with that and took the brunt of that physical and mental abuse. I was used to laugh, and I can laugh at it now. My dad had passed away a few years ago, and I love my dad. I finally came to terms with that. But I used to be the black and blue kid. I had a couple brothers and I had a mom. But when my dad lost it from his addiction, he became something completely different. And so I was homeless at age 12 looking for a place to live. I found a way to do that through an uncle. And then I went into the business world and I started climbing the corporate ladder quickly. And I just recently did a TED Talk in February 2020. I love your audience to check it out. The first time I came forward with my story, and I said that I was a self-worth chaser, not a success chaser. So the truth is, about age 21, I became a manager and then a CEO at age 31. I didn't even know what it was, VJ. I just knew, like, I've had a bit of ego. I wanted to have a big house, a paycheck, and they said in school, Tom, you're good at business. You should go into that. And I get to the CEO level, and each time I was climbing, I was doing well, winning awards, but I started stumbling. I had some challenges relating to people. And then I remember getting to the top where I had everything I wanted. And there was this hole in my soul. I just couldn't figure out, why am I still seeking? What am I still looking for? Wind the clock forward, and there's a lot more in between, I guess. In 2007, there were three major events in my life. One is I was downsized from my CEO position. Company merged, and myself and five vice presidents, we got our little envelopes. And my wife now of 26 years, Anna, her mom had a pretty bad stroke, and my wife was a career banker at the time. And then the third one was, we unfortunately were caught up in a global fraud and we lost everything. We literally woke up in the summer of July 2007 with both out of work and all of our savings and assets stolen from us. And it turned out to be one of the world's biggest Ponzi schemes. And as career bankers, that's where we came from. We were like, what just happened? And we were so embarrassed we didn't even tell anyone. That led me, and I talk about this in my book, that led me on a journey to seek, what's the real meaning of my life. I've read many books, and there's a really good one by a monk who wrote a book about a CEO's quest for the meaning of life. Well, mine was like this, little Tommy's quest for the meaning of his life. And I started seeking, and for about 10 years, I did a lot of different things. I took courses. I did some of Tony Robbins' Master University, and I studied Napoleon Hill's Think and Grow Rich success formula. But I also grew up with mentors in the business world who were high-level business people, and I was looking for sort of mentoring from some of those folks. But I started realizing that many of them were navigating through life too, lost on this unthinking treadmill. Get up in the morning, go to work, make money, come home. And and that was after about 10 years. That's when I wrote my first book, and I decided, you know what? I'm going to become a thought leader. There's a story behind that, if you'd like me to get into it in a bit, that I traveled to Holland, Michigan, and spent some time with a fellow there who helped me really get out of my head all this wisdom. From there, I created my company. It's called KRE-A. It's an education company. And I really decided, VJ, to take everything I learned through my life and start teaching. And that's grown to a radio show, number one best-selling book, which is being made into a feature film. We have our second book coming out, and much more things happening. So that wind the clock forward, here I am today. And if you had met me in the 2000s, I don't think I would have said to you I'd be sitting here talking like this. But one more part of the story, and this is my TED Talk. In 2018, when everything was going extremely well, I was doing something called a Ride to Conquer Cancer. I don't know if you have that in the United States, but a buddy of mine, an engineer, lost his daughter to leukemia at age 11. And Meredith, she actually contracted cancer at age 9. It was in remission, and then she got it back and she passed. So Roger and I were sitting on my patio having a beer one day, and I used to do training for some of his business people because I was an educator. Roger says, "You want to do the Ride to Conquer Cancer?" And I said, "I've heard of that." He said, "I got 80 riders riding, and this is our 10th year, and we're going to try to push through the $1 million fundraising mark." And he told me about his daughter. And man, I mean, I'm a giver, so my heart grew like, the Grinch Who Stole Christmas, that scene where his heart grows 3 times. My heart's going like, I just want to help you. So I said, Roger, I'm in. I didn't even have a bicycle. I borrowed a bicycle, and he said, "You're crazy, man." He said, "Because it takes most people, this is a 225-kilometer ride over 2 days. I guess in American terms, that's 150 miles." And he said, "Most people take 6 months to train, but," he said, "You're going to do it in 3 months?" I said, "Yeah, there's no such thing in my mind about can't." So I do. We wind forward. The first leg of the ride was from what was called Cloverdale, close to where I am, 125K to what's called Chilliwack, British Columbia. And we stayed in a base camp. And then the next day was supposed to be further to what's called Hope, British Columbia. It's more up north in our province of BC. That summer was sizzling hot. There were forest fires burning. So we were actually riding in smoke and heat sometimes that was unbearable. And it started to rain a bit, which was better. First night, we are having a team dinner. I finished the first leg of the ride, 125K, feeling great. I stay in a motel with my wife. I step in the bathtub. Both feet, it was like the surface of the tub felt like ice. I'd never experienced it. Slipped out from under me. I fell backwards with huge force. I was 180 pounds. I don't remember anything too much after this, but I cracked a hole in the tub with my head, and I sustained a brain injury. And I blacked out, came to. My wife said to me, "You're not going to ride again." And so I remember sitting up in the motel with my head against the backboard, trying to get to sleep, and my head was ringing, and I didn't even know what a concussion was, but I was stubborn. And this goes back to the quiet warriors that there was no such thing as can't. So I said to Anna, I said, "I'm going to get up at 5 a.m. and the team truck was waiting downstairs. We'd all pile in, go get our bikes, and go for the second leg." She goes, "No, you're not." I said, this is true, VJ. I said, "You know what? People have cancer. They never had a choice. They had to keep fighting forward." So I said, if I can, I'm gonna ride." So I chewed Tylenol and I literally dragged myself through the last 125K. It was raining. I could barely see, and I didn't realize what was going on with my head. I got my medal, finished the finish line. I said, "Anna, put me in the car." We drove home a couple hours, and then that night, my daughter was home from university across the country, and we were sitting in the living room, and I had showered, and she walked by me. She said, "Dad, there's blood on the top of your head." And I looked, and my wife got up and she said, "Tom, there's cuts and lacerations on the top of your head." Now, VJ, I'd passed out and come to in the tub, but I didn't even think to look at my head. I just thought I banged my head. Well, my life stopped. I Within 2 months, my whole work disappeared. So I went from big income to nothing. I slipped into depression within 2 months and I had my first suicidal thoughts. And that was the beginning of a horrific 3 years. And here I am 3 years later. I've seen many experts and doctors. I've made much recovery. My eyes are not working properly. I fell on the back of my head where my vision center sits. So my eyes don't move from side to side like yours. But you'll never know about it because I don't believe people are resilient, need to use excuses. So I've learned to use my eyes in a different way. And although it creates a lot of pressure and deficits in some of my other parts of my brain, dude, I've learned brain science. I've gone through mental health therapy. My care team we're doctors, psychiatrists. I've discovered things in the last 3 years that have really set me on a new path to shape what I started as a thought leader in a bit of a different direction. So maybe I'll stop there because it was a simple question that so I told you how much time do you have. But here I am today and I'm excited and I've got lots of energy and man, you know what? I'm just glad I'm alive because if I they told me if I fell an inch the other way, I probably wouldn't be sitting here talking to you today.
Oh my gosh, that is such a powerful story. So, from your childhood, you went through a lot of ups and downs. It's a huge roller coaster. And recently, in the last 3 years, is when you had this injury, and you're here on this podcast and you're doing incredible things. And the first thing that comes to my mind is, first of all, congratulations on getting back up every time life hits you so hard. But what is it about you or other people in similar boats that make you, I guess, come back after you get pushed down or knocked out? Because that is incredible.
Yeah, being a storyteller, I just kind of riff. My mind goes in different directions because it's three dimensional. So just stop me when you want. When you said that, I thought about Sylvester Stallone, and the story of Stallone. I think he was a forceps baby, so he talks funny and his mouth is crooked, right? And he wanted to be an actor, so he wrote the screenplay for Rocky. If you've seen Rocky, and the trilogy became something amazing, right? But so he was peddling that, and he everybody just said, "Oh, that's nice." And so he through Hollywood, I think he made it over almost 1,000 different calls to people knocking on doors. He just wanted people to take his screenplay and believe in it, but he wanted to play the lead role of Rocky, and they all laughed at him and said, you can't because you talk funny." It got down to, I remember this when he told his story, he needed $12,000. He actually sold his dog. He sold his dog, believe it or not, his best friend. And finally, on one of the last calls, somebody says, "Okay, we'll make this film, and you can be Rocky, and the rest was." So I believe that it's resilience that gets you up when you get knocked down. But what is resilience to me? I think uh, resilience, I believe, like a superpower. But you can't have resilience unless you've been knocked down. So resilience comes from adversity. So I do know people who have lived good lives, have had good childhoods. They really haven't had any big pitfalls. When you haven't gone down the journey of being knocked down, if you haven't seen that path, you haven't developed the strength of getting back up again. You have to get knocked down. You have to fall in the bathtub or do or something big like that to be able to get up and say, you know what, I've got to go seek and learn some things out of this, and then you come back like a guide or a shaman to teach. So I think it's really about adversity. I believe that the strongest people in the world are those who have adversity. And here's the thing that'll blow your mind. I'll give you this. Oprah Winfrey says it's 90%. I think research, because I've looked into this deeply, says 80% of people have some form of past trauma. Trauma is simply when you have something tragic or traumatic happen. And let's just say I saw somebody go through the windshield of a car in an accident when I was 12. That's traumatizing, right? So 20 years later, I'm sitting having coffee with you and I relived that. That's what trauma is. So whether you've gone out of business, your partner stole from you, you went bankrupt, or whether you lost a child or you had a childhood like mine, everybody has trauma. But here's the thing I learned, VJ, especially men. Men are taught to be tough, not to cry, not to show vulnerability. But everybody has something, but not everybody talks about it. And when I was a kid, I remember thinking that I was screwed up. There's something wrong with me. But went out in the real world and started working with people and thinking everybody's perfect because nobody talked about their flaws. And so flip the narrative. Now you start learning because of mental illness and things and all the stuff you see on social media. That one in like I said, 80 to 90% of people have something. And so that's the answer to the question that I'd say is that what gets you back up again is really the pain uh, and the setbacks that you went through. Now, I guess I have to maybe correct that a little bit and say one thing that not everybody who falls in a bathtub, cracks their noggin like I did, and is impaired for life, or at least we don't know if we'll fix my eyes yet. Not everybody gets up and powers through. A lot of people might turn to alcohol. They might get addicted to something else. They might take their life. So I think a big part of that getting up again is you have to have something in you. You have to have something in you to fight for. So when I was an abused kid, I remember later in life wanting to fight for the underdog, wanting to fight for all the children who were living in homes where they were being treated like me. So that kind of drove me. That was always in me, that if I can go into the world and make it better. So they say Napoleon Hill, who is a big mentor of mine, Think and Grow Rich. I think it's 100 million copies of that book and widely read. He says nobody survives without or succeeds without definiteness of purpose. And if you have this burning desire inside, and I think that's a part of what Olympians do. I have a friend who's an Olympic gold medalist, and I had him on my podcast once, and I said, he said, Tom, if you knew what we had to go through to stand on the podium 4 years later and have a gold hanging around our necks, he said, man, he said, you have to do 11 hours every day of the highest intensity training, and you have to be able to keep doing things for 4 years, and there's a chance you might not even win the medal. So he said, basically, if you have a burning desire in you to be an Olympic athlete, that's what keeps you when you're knocked off your path. When people said you say you're crazy or when you feel doubt, that's what really keeps you going. And that's what I found. I had to take a 10 years to figure out what that little thing was. A lot of CEOs, high level leaders call it a chip on their shoulder, right? It's that thing that drives you, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks so much for sharing that. If you wouldn't mind, could we get a little bit deeper on the mental illness aspect of this conversation?
Yeah, sure. And I've got to say that I I was blown away, and never again will I complain about my life, because when I started really when I slipped into depression and I learned about really what mental illness can do, and started coming around people who had it, I was just like, my life can't be that bad. And so there's many forms of mental illness, and I'll go back to I'm doing a lot of work with neuroscience, and so we'll start with the brain, because there's a stigma when you say mental illness. So I like to talk about it from a point of view of brain. So we have this thing in our head called the brain, and I said, get a checkup from your neck up, right? Why we go get our hearts checked, get a checkup from your neck up. But your brain is made of fat, it sits in liquid, and your brain has all these electrical charges. That's its energy source, and it has millions of these neurons, little vessels. And your brain basically just has thoughts and attaches emotions and sensations to them. And then that's what your brain tries to tell you what's going on in your current reality. That's its biggest job. Your brain's connected to your spinal cord at your brainstem, and then all the intricate little circuitry and everything that controls your body from your brain is all through that. It's a pretty amazing machine we have. However, when things go out of whack in your brain, whether it's through distress or whether it's through constant trauma or whether it's through a concussion like me, brain injury, you can have chemicals in your brain shift, and it can lead to things like depression, things like anxiety. Then there's some very serious mental illnesses, bipolar disorder, multiple personality disorder. What I learned through psychiatry is that psychiatry and mental illness, psychiatry is the only uh, area of medicine where they don't actually touch the organ that they're trying to cure. So psychiatry, and for your listeners, is a really good podcast called the Huberman Lab. Andrew Huberman is a Stanford scientist, and I was told to listen to it when I went to my brain clinic for therapy. Andrew was talking about this, that psychiatrists basically do this. When I sat down with my psychiatrist for him to diagnose me, they have you fill out some questionnaires and then they just talk to you. And based on what you tell a psychiatrist, that's based on what they form their diagnosis on. And it's a very dangerous thing, because when I was experiencing my first suicidal thoughts and not knowing what depression was, I was vulnerable. I was ashamed. And when I sat down with this doc, and it was by Zoom, by the way, because of COVID, I didn't know I was supposed to tell him all the right things. You know how they say if you go to your regular doctor, the doctor asks you questions, make sure you tell them everything, because they can't figure things out unless you tell them the facts, right? So this kind of scared me, because I was not sure about being diagnosed or if it was a waste of my time. When I slipped and was concussed, I went to a brain clinic, and I'll just illustrate it visually for you. If you take a snow globe, you know what a snow globe looks like, the Christmas snow globe. You shake it up, all those little crystals. So when you get concussed, your brain gets smashed inside your skull. All the brain chemicals dislodge and then they fall wherever they want to. That's the easiest way to explain it. And most concussions you can recover within, weeks. 80% people fully recover, 20% never recover. They have long-term permanent issues, which is like me. When I 2 months into this concussion, I because I couldn't work, so my money ended and I was running out of money. I had a daughter in university to support. I was horrified, man. I didn't know where I was going to end up. And for the first time in my life, I had fear because I was out of control. I'm self-employed. I've built this thought leadership platform, and what am I going to do? And one of the unpredicted side effects of concussions is mental illness, and you can actually make yourself get mentally ill. So here I was sitting at home and I was really ruminating almost for a year. I was sitting at home trying to figure out what am I going to do, and I wasn't getting any therapy and getting help yet. Uh, and I remember sitting one day and just zoning out, and I was just sad. And then it continued to happen. Not far after that, I this is my first suicidal thoughts. I got in my car and I was driving out probably about an hour to a credit union. So it's one of the people that I did some training for before, and I had a workshop I had to do. This was a piece of work I had. I thought if I can do this, even if I'm ill, I need the money. I didn't have much else going on, and I was driving in a white four-door sedan down what we call Highway 1. It was January, winter time. It was snowing, lots of snowflakes. And to my right, if you're in the car and if you look to your right, there's all this forest. So there's lots of trees, evergreen trees. And all I remember is I zoned out in my head and I envisioned walking into the woods with my suit on and my briefcase, lying down on my back, putting the briefcase on my chest, and then wishing wolves and animals would come and tear my body apart. And I literally saw that happen. And then I closed my eyes and I went to sleep and I was at peace. And I literally woke up in my car and it came back to in my conscious mind. And I remember it. I was in a daze driving towards this workshop, and I didn't really even know what happened. So I get to the workshop and the CEO who I know, and it's his leadership team. I say hi and I do the workshop. And after he comes to me, he says, "Are you okay?" I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, you just seemed off." He said, "I know you." And that's when I knew something was wrong. So I basically went home, but I didn't go get help because of the stigma of mental illness. People don't really want to talk about it. 2 months later, I had a vision of my daughter um, hanging by a rope in her dorm room back east. And she's 24 years old. And when you have a vision of somebody you love hanging by a rope, you can't get that out of your head. And so that's when I knew I needed help. So this was like now a year and a half into my concussion because I'm getting help at a brain clinic for trying to figure out, the things that were broken. I had gait issues, I had balance issues, had cognitive thinking issues. But I kind of thought, like a lot of people, that this mental stuff is just going to go away. Finally, when I had that vision, my daughter, I knew I needed help. So through a referral, I got in to see a psychiatrist. He's actually a good friend of mine. One of the things I didn't tell you is I spent 10 years as a chair of a board with a mental health not-for-profit called the Mood Disorder Association of British Columbia. And I just went on that to learn as a young leader and be on a board of directors. But in my lifeline, my younger brother has Tourette's syndrome, which is a neurological logical disorder. It's a horrible one where you make funny noises and things involuntary. And when I was younger, I remember now talking to you that my cousin at age 11 was found hanging in a barn in the Fraser Valley at age 11. And he was born and he had an extra thumb. This is just kind of awful to talk about, but he had a deformity and he was dark skinned like I am. I'm South Asian and he was picked on. And next thing you know, we found that he took his own life. So what I learned about depression is this: the clinical diagnosis of depression is this: it's 2 or more weeks of sadness without a triggering event. So I don't know if you have any pets, but my little Shih Tzu, my little miniature Shih Tzu dog, Shadow, 16 years. I mean, if she was alive today, she'd be sitting right here below my chair. We had her since my daughter was born. She passed away. So you lose your dog and maybe you get depressed, right? You get down, you have some sadness, but then you get over it. But if you go 2 or more weeks of waking up, and if you wake up in the morning or you're sitting just by yourself and you feel blah, sad, and you really can't figure out why, that's a clue that you might be heading into a cycle of what they call depression. And there's all sorts of things to this. There's things called neuromodulators. There's brain chemicals like dopamine and serotonin. Dopamine is released in our brain for anticipation of reward, and it gives you a good feeling. And then serotonin really, if that chemical, just like the snowflakes in the snow globe, gets out of its baseline level, because we all have levels that we have innately in our way we're structured in our brains, that can lead to depression. So I was diagnosed with depression, and I also learned that suicidal thoughts are not about just taking your own life. Suicidal thoughts are about thinking about harm to other people. And that's why when I had that vision of my daughter, and these things just came in my head, and I've never thought about things like that. I knew there's something wrong. So I went into and I was against medication, and I hear all the horror stories. And I was in mental health 10 years, and so I knew a lot of people who went on these powerful psychotropic drugs. And listen, drugs are powerful, right? They have side effects. Funny commercial I remember. There's a because I have a friend who was with McKesson Pharmaceutical as the chief sales guy, and he says, yeah, he said we create drugs and then they have side effects, and we create other drugs to cover up those side effects. So there's this commercial about a arthritis drug, and I remember watching it on TV one day, and it says have these people on swings and they're happy and all. It's like la di da di da. This is your life the way it's going to be. And by the way, you get older, you'll have arthritis. So take this drug. And then you see in the fine print, one of the side effects is swollen joints. And I'm all like, okay, great. I'll take this drug, but one of the side effects is swollen joints. But I have arthritis already. And so these are powerful drugs. And I believe in taking medication if a psychiatrist requires you to take it. And to all those people out there who are skeptical, you don't want to get on medication and feel you have to be on it for life. But some people are so seriously ill with depression or with bipolar and things, sometimes you have to stay on medication. With depression, you generally will get things like antidepressants. But it is true, if you take antidepressants and it's diagnosed and not the right kind of thing, it can make more unpleasant thoughts happen. So the way you do is you get a good psychiatrist, they assess you, and then you go on. So if you go on medication, then you monitor it and they manage you on it. And if things are off, you kind of change things up. Here's the thing about that. After going on some medication, my doctor said, I want you to take cognitive behavioral therapy. And this is the thing that gets me really, really excited. If you Google it, you'll find a lot on this. Cognitive behavioral therapy. I just actually created a workshop, a health and wellness 2 hour workshop, and I taught it yesterday. Actually, I'm testing it in the market, and I brought into it some of these cognitive skills I learned. Cognition is your thoughts, behavior is how your thoughts behave, and therapy is the word therapy. So, believe it or not, your brain is like plastic. And through neuroplasticity, you can mold and shape your brain. But many people don't learn, especially when they're younger, how their thought patterns and how their brain works. So my doc said, I want you to take this course. It's paid for under our Medicare. He said, it's 9 weeks. You'll be 2 hours a week sitting in a classroom with 10, 15 other people. And of course, I was kind of nervous, right? So I go to my first course and I walk in the door, and man, it was something else. Young, there's a girl my age, there's older guys like my dad's age. And, over here is somebody who's got bipolar. As I started learning, there's somebody over there who's got multiple personality disorder. For some of these people, the hardest thing was getting up in the morning and getting to the classroom. And that's when I started realizing that, wow, we sometimes, even if we don't have mental illness, we complain about our lives. But I remember days getting up when I fell into depression that brushing my teeth was too hard, because they say that when you're in depression, small things become mountains. You hear stories of people not showering for 4 days. And I'm going to be not embarrassed to tell you that there was a week at home where for 5 days I didn't shower. For days I didn't brush my teeth. It's just I didn't want to get out of bed and I wanted to go back into bed. But if you're under treatment and getting help, then you're going to know that you're going to work through it. But the monster I call it. Depression is unpredictable. The good news is we were taught you can live with mental illness, you can live a good life. It's a myth to say that you can get rid of mental illness because uh, if you have mental illness, it's usually something that for a lifetime you have to manage, and you can manage it through health, you can manage it through diet, you can manage it through if you have to take medication, but you can manage to live healthy. I was also diagnosed with general anxiety, and anxiety is uh, it's like we were taught it's like a fraction. So the numerator of that fraction is the belief that bad things will happen over the denominator, the belief I can cope with bad things that will happen. So when you about 80% or more of society has anxiety, right? You going into write an exam and you're all stressed and anxious. You're walking into a board meeting like I used to report out on the company and it's not doing so well. You get tingly, a little warm, you get anxious. So when you have anxiety, it's really about being able to manage your thoughts. You worry about the future before it happens. Sometimes you're worrying about the past because something hasn't been finished. So I was just diagnosed with this generalized anxiety, and so I still have that. It comes and goes, and I know how to dial it down. I know how to manage it. So even coming on your show, if I start to experience some emotions or sensations, so anxious, and a lot of people do, I know how to deal with that. So going back to, and I just want to finish up on cognitive behavioral therapy. Man, for 9 months, they gave us a workbook. I learned 166 skills. 166 skills from everything from how to actually dial down anxiety to calm down your brain waves. There's some very simple skills. One of them was called the opposite action skill. So they call it the false promise of avoidance. But when you're depressed, sometimes you just don't want to go out and talk to people. So they taught us a skill. The false promise of avoidance means if you don't want to go talk to people, the more you don't talk to people, the more your mental illness, because connection with human beings is a way to actually create good energy and chemicals in the brain. Actually, as a healer. So they just taught me to say to pause and say no, I'm going to go do it, and then just push through. Right. I learned all these skills, and at the end of the class, they asked us all, "What's the one thing that all of you would say was the biggest aha moment?" All of us unanimously, VJ said, "Why isn't this taught to children or to parents and to youth? Why isn't this taught in school? Why isn't this taught in MBAs and things?" And you know what the answer was? At least in my country, you have to be diagnosed with a mental illness before you can access this type of education. So here's my new mission, because I talked about it in my TED talk. By the way, when I did my TED talk, I was standing on the side of the stage with loss of memory, with impaired vision. I wanted to throw up, and for 6 months I was working with a coach even to do one. And but I said to myself, I want to do it while I'm ill so I can talk about it later. A lot of the things I'm talking about with the cognitive therapy skills, dealing with my psychiatrist to get care, enabled me to stand on stage for 20 minutes, 15 minutes, and do a TED talk that I got pretty good reviews. But I almost wanted to throw up before I went on that. So this is the thing about you talked about mental illness. Sadly, it's hard to access help. There's too much stigma about it, and the world needs to find a way to get people more education and access to help. So my part of my new mission now is my next book coming out is about mental illness, but it's actually a book on teaching leaders skills to prevent or to also in their workplaces lift the stigma of mental health through teaching them skills. My TED talk and that are kind of connected, and now I'm doing some workshops in my training business focused on, and I remember yesterday when I did it, it was a group of 17 construction guys. These are superintendents on up. They're all crusty guys, tattoos, egos. And I had them for 2 hours. And one of the guys broke into tears. He said, "Why didn't I learn this? Blah, 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 a long time ago." And I said, "You guys have a gift. You have the power to direct your mind to choose what you want to believe. And then you can basically manifest that. So if you're depressed, if you're stressed, if you've got bad feelings, and a lot of that is wired into just things that were put in us or things that have happened to us, you have the ability to really work through that. And you can use skills. Medication is there as well. So I know I've said a lot, but I don't know if I answered your question about mental illness. But my story was really that it was the unintended consequence of a concussion, slipping in depression, a year and a half later getting help. And then now I basically navigate my life with dealing with general anxiety. And I still take my antidepressant medication, but I'm way much stronger and better now. And, I just think that there's a lot of people out there who probably don't know it, but they're dealing with some type of mental stress. And my advice is just pay attention to the signals, right? And reach out, try to get some help.
Tom, thank you so much for being vulnerable and sharing your story. That is very powerful, and I'm sure our audience members can definitely gain a lot from that. I want to take the conversation a few different ways. So, something I'm all about action and taking experiences such as what you've been through and applying it to other people. You said that there's no cure to mental illness, but there's ways to cope with it. So, just with one of your examples, you talked about your TED Talks and just coming on the show. What happens if you're feeling one of those depressive episodes where you don't want to get up in the morning, you haven't showered? What are some things that you can do when you're in that state so you can still function, or I guess keep up with some of your promises, like appearing on a TED Talk?
Yeah. I mean that in itself is a lot more. Is not a simple answer, but in the CBT course or the cognitive course, the therapy I took, um, there's a couple things. I'll just start basically that the brain can't have a positive or negative thought at the same time. It just doesn't happen. So there's some hacks, I call them, some things you can do to try to work your way through that feeling of sadness. The first thing is pay attention to it and realize that something's not right. Uh, when I get up in the morning, when I feel like that, I have a new routine. I have uh, Spotify, and I find I have a channel that has nature sounds. So I'll turn that on. So I'll turn my room or my home into a Zen like place. So I don't look at my cell phone. I don't listen to the news because it's full of negative, right? So I put on first of all. So nature has a very big impact on the way the brain feels. I will also one of my other hacks is journaling. So if you are feeling sad, one of the cool things is you can teach your brain to relive something that's joyous and happy by actually reliving it by writing it down. So I would have a journal and I would think of something positive or happy that happened the day before, and I would write it down. And when you write it down and you step back from that thought and you look at it with your eyes, through neuroplasticity, your brain actually relives it, right? So, for example, one of my happy stories was when I was in my kids were young. I used to go up to a place called Osoyoos, BC, which is a desert with a lake. And so my favorite vision of that was sitting on the beach with a cocktail and looking at the ocean and the mountains and having my family around me. So there were days where I woke up where I just couldn't see the future because depression is like you're sad. You don't. I would write in my journal, even a paragraph, and I'd read it out loud, and I'd just pour into my brain these positive thoughts. You can do affirmations. You can say things out loud, right? Like I am love, I am joy, I am happiness. And what you're really doing is on demand on your own, you're bombarding your brain or your unconscious brain with just positive thoughts. And I call it like seeds or weeds. Weeds are the negative thoughts, the sadness. You can start putting in there a little bit at a time on your own some positive things, and you're building that up. Another one is exercise. Believe it or not, going out and one of the things that releases the chemical in the brain that creates good feeling, you can is through exercise. And I was told by my doctor, and it's true, that lifting weights is actually one of the best ways to release that. So whether you get up and you do a minute of intense jumping jacks, or like bouncing up and down like you're on a treadmill, or going for a walk around the block, just use that opposite action skill and say, you know what, I don't feel great, but you know what, I can do it. I've done it before. I'm gonna just go, even if it's for a short walk. I'm gonna just go and I'm gonna take a dumbbell and I'm gonna do some dumbbells. Right. So physical exercise actually creates the chemicals in the brain that make you feel good. Another one is find, if you're going through depression, find a peer group or find somebody else who has experience and connect to them. So I had a friend who went through depression, and it was really hard because when people go through it, they don't really want to talk to other people. But I got to a point where, well, through the year I was going through it in a bad way, I would send a text to my friend John, who struggled, still does, serious depression. He's a radio announcer, and I said, "Do you just have time to chat? You want to have a coffee?" And he came to my house and he sat in my living room with me, and we just talked. And what's funny is, what did we talk about? I talked about how I didn't tell you this part, but for 2 years I was a night stalker at Costco. So my doctor said, get your ass out there and do something physical, or you're going to slip deeper into depression. I went online and applied for a job at Costco and at minimum wage. And I put a runner's cap on and I grew a beard. I was embarrassed because I was a CEO type guy. I basically went and stocked produce till midnight. And it was hard, man. I had to say my prayers and talk to God about it. Just keep me here as long as you need. But that was like a workout. My Fitbit would tell me it'd be like 10,000 steps a shift. It was hard, right? But that actually I lost some weight, and it would be like this adrenaline rush, and it made me feel a little bit better. So physical, connecting with people. John and I, when we sat down here and talked, instead of talking about things that most people would talk about, I started telling him about how I was stalking at nightly at Costco, and I was embarrassed. And John goes, "Yep, been there." And I find out that he's like a high paid, like he makes over $500,000 a year as a radio announcer, award winning in our city. And he said, when I went through this, Tom, he said they told me to take a year off, and he said I went and cut lawns. He said I went. He said you wouldn't believe the stuff I did just to keep moving forward. So that's part of my message is find ways to keep moving forward, right? And push through. And it's okay if you don't take the shower for a couple of days, but when you start doing some of these little things, you're going to start seeing some impacts. Most importantly, don't kid yourself. If you have clinical depression, you have to have a psychiatrist, somebody who, because psychiatrists, the difference you probably know is counselors can't prescribe medication, psychiatrists can. So the one thing I recommend you don't do is find a counselor, and they're available everywhere, where you walk and sit in a room and they say, okay, how you doing? And you talk for an hour, dumping all your worries, and then they give you a little piece of paper saying, okay, go away and write down some goals and try to fill in a little bit of that color in your life. The last thing you want to do is sit and talk about all your problems for a period of time, because what that does is basically the way the brain works is all those thoughts get logged in as new thoughts. So our unconscious mind builds up this thing of negativity, and our brain just stays there. We talk about being depressed, you're going to look for more depression. So you want to find either a good counselor who really gives you some therapy, some things, exercises you can do, or like I fired my first one. I said, I'm not coming back here. But most importantly, get on a list, go to your doctor, get referred, get in to see a good psychiatrist. I'll say this boldly, and I say this to all of my people that I teach, all the people I teach in business. Everybody should have on their care team. If you have a personal trainer, great. Right? If you have a coach, great. Should have a psychiatrist on their personal care team. So Dr. Ron, once a month, I Zoom with him, and I think for the rest of my life, because it's covered by my Medicare, I think I'll keep him even when I get healthy. Because what I find myself doing is, like, let's just say today I have all this stressful stuff. I have a journal and I just write a list, and I go, okay, good, I can't wait. And next week I'm seeing Ron, and I just keep my list. I park it there, and I don't worry about it. And then when I get on Zoom with Ron, we talk through stuff. He'll give me some tips. He'll encourage me, right? And it really helps. But psychiatrists are really trained professionally, the good ones, on how to understand psychology and how to actually help you work through that. Never go online, by the way, and use those online calculators, because you can diagnose yourself with a mental illness. It's dangerous if you do that and you just pretend that you can figure it out. You don't want to do that.
Oh, thanks so much for that advice, Tom. So you're saying for people who are experiencing depression or just one of those phases, they can, I guess, listen to nature, they could journal, have positive affirmation, exercise, connect with people, and see a psychiatrist.
Yeah, get some professional help who know how to deal with the brain, because that's what you're dealing with.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Let's shift gears a little bit. Let's talk more about what you're doing professionally now, because I'm curious about the quiet warrior and how this all connects together.
Yeah, so there was in 2004. 15, I got on an airplane and flew to Holland, Michigan, in your country, and met with a company. Well, John LaDuca was the founder. He's a young 40-year-old, smart guy, and I knew about him through a company I was working for here. And John basically has a company called the Wisdom Link, and he said guys like me come in there, and he mostly from Europe and North America. And he said, we're guys who have been like doing work for 20, 30 years, and we come in there as lost souls, and we're just searching, what do I do with all this wisdom in our head? So I was a seeker, as I told you, right? So called John. It cost me $7,500 US, which I had no money because remember, we went broke through that fraud. Put on my credit card. My wife was supportive. And I went down, had dinner, and then I spent a day with John. And he just kept bombarding me with questions. It was a process. It was called the Innovation Lab. He said, who's the person you're going to serve? He said, what's the avatar of that person? He said, what's your gifts? What's your story? Based on all your executive work, what is it, your unique ability? And he went through this whole thing. Within about 5 hours, we had mapped out on the whiteboard the blueprint for my company, Create, KREAT, which is my education company. So the whole idea was to turn Tom, who is a paid executive, and I worked for 30 years and across 5 sectors. And I started as an entry level guy, but through my career, I've been through probably 11 or 12 mergers and alliances, acquisitions. Some failed, some worked. I've been, entry level right up to CEO. I've been chair of the board for a decade. I've done everything. But again, I was lost. And so I thought, why don't I take all the wisdom in my head and turn it into a way to teach? So that basically I became an educator. And so the company launched in 2016. We built the brand. And then I created a coaching formula. It's a 6 phase coaching program called The Way of the Quiet Warrior. And that whole 6 phases has everything I did when I literally lost my job and was downsized and was lost. It has all the research, all the things I did to navigate through to creating the life I have today. A big part of it, I did a deep dive on brain science. I did a deep dive on personality science, understanding why people are different, they communicate differently. And then I took all of the experiences I had working for bosses and being a boss, because I started noticing around me in the workplace that there's a lot of toxic leaders who can't get along with people or aren't getting promoted or just struggling in their careers. And so I took a lot of that wisdom too. So on my website, you'll see the Way of the Quiet Warrior, the 6 phases. And then John said, if you're going to build a business, you should build a business where you could step away from it very quickly. And a business that's run for sale is a business. Meaning, if you have processes and systems, if something happened to Tom, the business would stay. And if it has recurring revenue, it becomes an asset, right? And because we lost a lot with our fraud, I wanted to have a legacy to leave for my family, but also something that would create value. So the foundation was the platform, this company to educate. Then the core program was the Way of the Quiet Warrior. So it's actually anything from a 3 month to 1 year uh, coaching program. And it's designed for business owners or high success people who have something missing and they're looking for ways to unlock either the greatness within them that they can't find or deal with, not knowing what their future holds. Maybe they're seeking like me for what's the meaning of my life. And so we take them through this process. And then I did other services. So I added on more things. I started up executive coaching, so 1-to-1. So people can hire me for a year or they can do 1 hour at a time. And there's everything I do is from the perspective of motive. So why do you do what you do? So I don't teach behavioral science in my work. I've actually partnered with Dr. Taylor Hartman out of Utah Valley University, who taught me the science of the why behind behavior. So, for example, if you're in a meeting with another person and they're sitting there quietly and they're not talking, if I can teach you to understand why they do that versus judge them for their behavior, it's far more powerful. So I really had this curiosity because I was such a broken kid going into business as a broken adult. I never knew the rules of how to love people, how to communicate with people effectively. It never taught me. There's only one other book, by the way, I found that gave me that wisdom, is the Bible. And I started reading that. It's another story. We would have to go on forever. But I actually got across and started reading the Bible when I was working at Costco, praying. And I was baptized Catholic. My dad was a Hindu. And so I was confused. and I had a picture of Christ in our home, but I used to not like that picture because of what was happening in my home. But anyway, getting back on track. So we create the company. It was really supposed to be a company to teach. And for me, what I wanted to do was replace my income through the company. So build this business, get to a level where I had the same income. So at least I could look after my family. And then from there, I created a podcast. And the idea was to bring leaders to the show who could talk about their adversity, but actually be vulnerable and share the truth about why they got to where they were. And these are men and women, leaders meaning anybody who's leading in something, right? Business of your own, small business, big business, self-employed, not for profit. And that took off. Now I'm at 220 interviews, and I actually have agents sending me people from all over I don't even know. And it's remarkable because something started happening on the show where people started opening up about their mental illness or experience with it. And so I have countless stories of people, and I think 8 of them will be featured in my next book about, for example, Lee Cockrell, who's a former executive VP of Walt Disney World. Lee was there for 15 years and he taught 44,000 cast members. He opened up the world of Disney and he ran the operations. Lee slipped into depression and he went through a cycle of it. So he's in my book. He talks about what happened, why he went through it, how he came out the other side. So this started happening on the radio show, and then I I remember John said you got to be a thought leader. So Tommy said you should consider writing a book. And I'd been given a lot of books, but I was standing my own way because I never really created a book because I didn't know how. The biggest thing I was afraid of is myself. Will anybody read it? But I decided to write a book that was a hybrid business book, one that told stories, but actually stories that were fictionalized from real events in my life. And then in between the stories were the 6 phases of my coaching program. So it'd be like story one, phase one of my coaching program, and it all connects. So you kind of move through this evolution, right? The book went number one on Amazon in Canada, US, 3 months before we did the actual publishing. And then about 6 months after that, Moving America Forward, which is a TV show, uh, which is actually was put together by William Shatner, Star Trek fans, and he's a Canadian. We got called down to Hollywood and we did a TV show and got an award for the work I was doing with the book and helping move people forward. So that's on my website. And so all this stuff started happening. Once you become a thought leader, I'm pretty humble, but you get stuff coming at you and it's like, is this really happening? But what it is people see you as different. They want to know more about what you're doing. Today, we're actually the book is being made into a feature film. So a film company in Ohio, through a friend of mine, a fellow author, we spent 3 years, and we actually did it while I slipped into my depression. We wrote the screenplay, so it's done, and it's called The Way of the Quiet Warrior, based on true events, and it's radical. You can go to my website page. There's a film page on it, and you can see actually a trailer, what's called concept trailer video. In that film, we're going to have a story of a business executive like me, or of me, going through my life from childhood up to the top parts of my career. From the outside, what you would see as a successful person, but it's going to actually have this back end of it where this guy's been eaten away by wolves in his head. So, no pun intended, but it's going to actually show what it's like to live with stress, mental illness, childhood trauma, but leading the world. And so we're going to have threads of mental illness, of homelessness, of addiction, everything in there, including a big part about my relationship with my dad, who did pass away recently. So now we got that film piece going, and I started after TED Talk having this vision of doing more professional speaking. So I'm working on probably 2 or 3 talks that I'll take on the road when I'm healthy enough. Again, all building on this whole thing. And then the latest edition of this whole journey, I've just been selected as one of 6 people to be what's called a founding fellow for what's known as the Institute of Organizational Neuroscience. And I'll just be really quick because it can be confusing, but it's quite an honor. I'm actually working with a coach to do my PhD, so it's uh, it's blowing my mind, and it's something that I'm thinking like Dr. Dutta, like Buddha, but what I discovered through my concussion, they say God puts you on a path to learn new things. He strips you, and I almost lost my life and everything because you still have more to learn. Because of the 3 years of therapy, I did advanced brain therapy in a clinic. I had some medical devices, and I learned all about how the brain works. it's very well known that in business, a lot of consultants and leaders, they learn what's called organizational behavior. So everything you do to develop your people in business is around behavior. But organizational neuroscience is sort of the untapped, the unknown frontier. It's like, how can I take the knowledge of the working of your brain and teach you, VJ, that you have these superpowers that if you can learn to harness them, you can be even more successful than just somebody teaching you how to behave. So we're working on that. We just launched that, and so that's going to be a big part of my work going forward. I'm actually looking to create a breakthrough if I can do my thesis that's connected to some of what I've learned is through this journey. So that's where we're headed. The Quiet Warrior really is the avatar. One that night over dinner with uh, John. Again, VJ, I feel like I'm just throwing up on you, but there's just so much to cover in short time. My life, I captured this actually for an exercise, but I had to look at my whole life and put it together in terms of. And my wife said, "Tom, there's so much you've done in your life and so many experiences. It's like, oh my God, that's why telling I can go off track, but there's just so many things." So the Quiet Warrior, how did that come about? That night I went to see John. We had dinner the night before we did the day in the boardroom doing the blueprint for my company. And he said, "Tell me what you do." He said, "I want to know the greatness behind the man." And he had a cocktail and I had a martini in my hand. And I said, "Well," I said, I've been a business leader. I've done everything. I guess I teach people. I have them teach me. I build companies." And I said, sometimes what I've realized is people just, my mom used to tell me, VJ, that people want to be around you because I have this emotional based personality. And I said, sometimes people just come to me in business. And when I started coaching in business in my companies, people would open up and tell me stuff, or they would just want my advice. So I said, I guess, I'm kind of just like that guy who goes along quietly, helping people. And I said, there's nothing that holds me back because I don't have a no in my brain. So, like a quiet, kind of like a warrior. And he stops me and he says, I don't know if this means anything, Tom, but he said, The Quiet Warrior, that could be the name of your first book. And so we go through the next day and come out of it. And he says, You got to read my book. He had a book called Thought Leader. And he said, You need to write. And so I wrote the book and titled it The Way of the Quiet Warrior, which is everything. I actually trademarked it. So that word mark is registered. Nobody can steal it. And I got the registration for the company as well, the company itself. So it was like, and then it became an avatar that really became my brand. So if you look at my book cover, I wear this black leather jacket. And there's another story there. My photographer told me and my wife to bring some clothes and bring your leather jacket. So we were in a studio and he goes, Okay, give me your badass look. So that is the cover of my book. I'm wearing a leather jacket, kind of looking serious. It's on my podcast show art. But one of the things that came through my concussion and the recent journey was that picture represents the armor that I had on. I'm actually like this with my arms crossed, black leather jacket, and I'm not really smiling. I'm kind of like badass. But the avatar is that was a quiet warrior. He was this guy underneath layers of crust, and he had this armor on. And he was being tough, but he's very quiet. And then when I slipped and I found God in my life and I got through this last phase, it was like, God helped me take off that armor and now I put on his armor. So now I'm open. You'll see in my pictures now I'm open. I'm not crossed armed, but I still use that avatar because the Quiet Warrior has taken a life. It's part of the book. It's a radio show, and it's not going to go away. It's going to continue to be because it's getting known out there. So
Awesome, Tom. Well, thank you so much. This has been an incredible story. Great episode. Really, really enjoyed this. Where can our audience get in touch with you, Tom?
the website www.create KREAT play on words.ca, and then on there's an info page. You can send me an email, and certainly I'm here to help in any way I can. And again, I do things for public speaking. If there's people who want to hear my stories live, I'd love it for your people to also go to my media page and see my TED talk because everybody watches it. The analytics on YouTube, they tend to share it more. My TED talk is called "How Leaders Can Lift the Stigma of Mental Health," and it's the first time I came forward as a lead business leader with my true story. So, yeah, there it is.
Awesome. And there's one more question which I ask every guest I have in the show. So forgot to ask you. But you've already answered it. What is your favorite book?
My favorite book, oh my goodness. Well, I'd have to say, I don't think I said the name of this one, but there's so many. So, the Think and Grow Riches, all the stuff Tony's written. My book obviously is now in my mind. But this may sound bizarre, but Patrick Lencioni wrote a couple books. Lencioni wrote a book called The Five Temptations of a CEO and The Five Dysfunctions of a Team. And when I read his book, I zipped through it. I couldn't put it down. But the reason why is he wrote it as a fable, like a story. And so I'm one of those guys who I've got a graveyard of books, and growing up and even in business, people give me tons of books. I can't read them because my mind's so wandering, it bounces all over the page. My dad was like that. But if I can read a story, because our brains are wired for storytelling, and I picked it up and went, man, I read this book from cover to cover. I've never done that. So I learned a lot from his two books, but actually it was the style of his writing, fable. So I wrote mine as a business hybrid, fable and business stuff. That would, I'd say, would be my favorite book from a selfish point of view.
Awesome. I'll put all this in the show notes. Tom, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.